Hello, everybody, and welcome to BAME Online Scholar. This is actually the first Scholar episode that we've done in 2023. I'm sure you've all been missing us. It feels like it's been a real while since we've kind of really dived in to some of these complex theories around anti-racism. I'm really looking forward to this event because we have been kind of talking about racial capitalism in the context of philanthropy for a really long time. But a lot of the time, I think we've just assumed that everybody knows what we're talking about. So this is an opportunity for us to kind of get back to basics, understanding what the history of racial capitalism is, how it has kind of, real life consequences and a legacy that can be seen in wealth disparities that we see today. A little bit about BAME Online, for those of you who do not know about us. We started as a fundraising conference in 2020, and since then we have grown into a home for political education in the charity sector. I'm really happy and fortunate to be joined by Khadijah, who has come on as our head of education and our resident scholar, who has been schooling us all internally on all things anti-racist practice, learning alongside us and helping us to really kind of push the charity sector to think really differently about liberation politics, to take it out of the kind of neoliberal frameworks that focus on the individual and start seeing ourselves as kind of agents of systemic change. What I've been really excited about is, as a lot of you will know, we've been kind of working out what BAME Online is going to be over the last few years. We started as a conference and we're growing into something so much bigger. Over the next few months, we are going to start unveiling some new aspects to BAME Online. And I would like to start by sharing our new Instagram page because we have joined the 21st century. Finally, we have an amazing comms person who has set us up on Instagram so that we can share loads and loads of resources, sound bites, small little clips, reading lists, resources that help you to build your anti-racist practice. We know that you can't rely on Instagram alone. So a lot of what we're going to be doing for our Instagram is like attracting you all with our amazing sound bites and then bringing you to our long form essays and our long form videos and events like this. And so I'm very excited that we have an Instagram page. Please follow it. I am going to hand over the reins to Deej, who is going to give us a not so brief history of racial capitalism. So take it away, Deej. I will interrupt you if there's anything that I don't understand. I hope that is okay.
That is absolutely fine. So I suppose the kind of best way to start is to think through kind of what brought us here. As you know, myself and Martha have kind of been engaging in this process and this journey of learning together, trying to have a better understanding of the key conceptual ideas that are a feature of anti-racism and that are a feature of our lives in trying to pretty much end or rethink the structures that cause our oppression. And so the question of racial capitalism was one that was inherently important. And the question posed in this talk, is capitalism racist, is an important question, because what we want you to actually think about is the way that the economic structure of our society, the economic structure of the globe, of the world, is predicated on some very racist technologies. In our sort of initial conversation in the talk we did about what is race, we began to understand this sort of concept of race as a technology, concept of race as not just a system of being, but rather a system of organizing, a system of assigning value, a system of locating us and creating the potential for particular outcomes.
And I just said already to expand on technology before people think we're talking about smartphones.
I think the sort of like smartphone is also an important point, right? We're talking about as in a technology, and we want you to think about it as a technology, literally, insofar as it offers us the possibilities of doing something, insofar as it organizes something, it produces something, it has an outcome and it has a purpose. That's specifically how we need to understand race and racism. It's not just a coincidental thing that happened to humanity on the basis of the fact that we have different pigments on our skin. It was, in fact, an intentionally designed entity that meant to mean something to us and meant to produce something as its outcome. Right. And it's also meant to be something that we use. And race is something that we use. Race is something that we legitimize in our day-to-day actions, in our day-to-day engagements with various systems, with various people, with various interpersonal sort of conversations. It's something we take for granted, but it is absolutely something that every single one of us uses. And that's why it's inherently important to locate race, not just in its technology as something we recognize has a utility, has a purpose, has a history, but also how this history is also embedded with other systems. Hence the question of capitalism, which is the question of the economics of race. So this conversation is really a conversation about the economics of race, the economics of our current climate, the economics of our history, and how it's been inseparably entangled with race and in fact racism. Because if we understand that, we can then understand the point about having conversations about funding, the point about having conversations about reparations, the point about having conversations about wealth and redistribution and who has wealth and who hasn't. In order to have those questions, we have to understand that race, this massive structure, works with capitalism and works in capitalism. So to sort of start off this sort of discussion, as always, I like to sort of take us on a bit of a journey. I like to start with history and bring us to the present moment. And this is how this conversation is going to unfold. So in the first instance, if we are going to talk about race, we have to understand the multiplicity of race, right? The multiplicity of the fact that race is not just a socially constructed idea, not just something that by happenstance was designed, or something that was designed by racists that had no other purpose than to separate us. In fact, it did have a purpose. And for a long time, and historically, and its initiation, the purposes of race as it existed was a purpose of delineating and segregating and assigning value on the basis of the economic value of things. So capitalism, sort of simply put, in order to start this, is a system through which production, consumption, and the way in which we engage with the world are predicated on the creation of value. And this value can be tied to labor, primarily. That was its initial sort of inception. And in this sort of construction of value, it was labor being exploited, labor being extracted, labor being expropriated, that allowed for wealth to transfer, that allowed for wealth to move. So the first system that I think is important to look at when we want to talk about the sort of historiography of race and the historiography of racial capitalism is to look at the body of capitalism, right? At its core, what was it about? And specifically locating this body to the logics of the plantation. Now, the plantation economy is a really good example of thinking through how labor is disaggregated, how labor is assigned, how labor is valued. And in this plantation economy, of course, we had racial categories, right? And racial categories were inherently tied to the types of value we assign to labor in the context of the plantation. If you were an enslaved Black person, you had no agency in the labor that you practiced. There was no consensual relationship in the way in which you exchanged your labor. Your labor was something that was part of your substantial oppression. It was part of what assigned you value, but value that you were not able to extract. You were not paid for your labor, right? You were considered chattel. And that means something for how we understand and experience the economics of the plantation. And then we had indentured servants, right? An indentured servant was a different sort of racial category of people. You had oftentimes white Irish people or Indian people who worked in the plantation to a degree, but were able to be remunerated for their labor, right? Were able to be paid sometimes small amounts. They were obviously hyper exploited, but their labor was distinguishable from the labor of the enslaved. And then you had the array of other white population who were assigned different levels of value, different levels of ability to engage within the economics of the plantation. Now, the violence of the plantation lays in a multifaceted way. Firstly, in the economic value of a human, the economic value of a slave, and this necessity to distinguish the slave as something that isn't human, to allow for the processes of its sale to happen. And so you had the racial category of Black as subhuman, as distinct from white, as distinct from indentured servants, so that this process was rationalized, so that this process had a logic. And we cannot distinguish the types of histories, the types of thought that was happening at the time. The people who came up with these classifications weren't ordinary people in these streets. They were the thinkers of the time. They were the scholars. They were the philosophers. They created this category, assigning a sort of epistemological, which means a sort of knowledge-based character to how we go about understanding the economics of racism. it's also important to recognize the brutality of the plantation economy. We often talk about the enslaved, who were absolutely subject to a cruel system of violence and extraction. But what many people don't like to talk about was how the slave trade in and of itself transformed from something that was, selling Black folk, something that was enslaving Black folk, to something that began to profit off the death of Black folk. So through the transition of the sort of plantation economy and through the transition of enslavement, slave owners, slave traders recognized that there was more value in putting an insurance claim on a ship full of enslaved Africans, sinking that ship, claiming an accident, claiming, oh, this just happened, and getting the surplus from insurance of the death of Black life, than even selling Black life to extract the totality of the labor it produces. That is the body of capitalism. That is the part of capitalism that we have to understand, that capitalism is predicated on these systems. This is the genealogy of capitalism. This system is why we have what we have. There are very few institutions in Britain that are not implicated in not only the selling of slaves, but also the institution that allowed Black death to become a system of profit. Now, from the transition of the plantation economy in the abolition of slavery, a sort of complex process, we also saw a transformation in the sort of economic logics of racism. So here, Black folk were not enslaved in the way we tend to think about them. They didn't have the totality of their labor extracted without the agency, without choice, without the ability to be remunerated for it. But what instead happened was we had the sharecropping economy. And the sharecropping economy was just a sort of rearticulation of the plantation economy. And the logics, because slavery was abolished, was that we can't not pay people, but we can hyper-exploit them. We can make it such that from the outside, it doesn't look like slavery. But for all intents and purposes, the livelihood, the realities of sharecropping was a form of indenturedness, was a form of hyper-exploitation, was a form of the extremities of wage slavery. So all of this kind of history of understanding that the economic base, the possibilities for us to exist in a capitalistic system is entrenched with these violences, is entrenched with the logics of the racialized system and the possibilities of operationalizing that racialized system to allow us to assign labor and to allow us primarily to extract value. So moving on from this, I mean, that historicization, I think, is of critical importance, because what it does is it gives us the reality of the fact that whether we like it or not, because we are all beneficiaries of this system, because we are all inheritors of the system, we are conscripted into it, right? We are conscripted into it in complex ways. Now, I want us to think about the kind of colonial economy, right? Which is another really important facet of understanding capitalist technologies. Now, my starting point for thinking about the colonial economy, thinking about empire, is thinking about it as a transition from the sort of logics of economic enslavement and the possibilities of that into a sort of more managed system of exploitation and extraction. When we think about the fact that empire was allowed to grow, when we think about the fact that empire allowed the possibilities for many of the things that we have now as citizens of Britain, then we cannot extract this from what was going on in the economic process. Right? Now, the primary logics of empire was the process of extraction, and many empires, specifically that of Britain, for example, operated in a sort of system of indirect rule, which I think is a really silly way to say, we're going to take everything, but you're not going to see us as much as you would in another context if we had a sort of settler economy. So in the sort of logics of a sort of indirect rule, the main process, the main organizational logic was extraction from the colonies, extraction from the lands, from the resources of Black and brown people for the benefit primarily for empire. It was all about resources. It was all about taking these resources away. However, in the advent of our transformation into a sort of newer form of economy, in the advent of the industrialization process that took place in Britain, there was also conditions of racialized labor that need to be considered, specifically in the need to export forms of labor that were viewed as violent forms of labor that people who were part of trade unions argued and fought against to the colonies, right? So when we think about the advent of better labor conditions for people in the empire, for people in Britain, that was only possible because of the labor conditions they exported to places like Pakistan, to places like India, to places like Ghana, to places all over the global south. When we think about the abolition of child labor in the context of Britain, that doesn't necessarily mean that the economic basis through which we are able to survive, the clothes that we're able to wear, the way we're able to engage in the market is now a sort of clean market that doesn't have child labor. No, what it means is that we exported it from where we could see it to somewhere we can't see it. And this is another form of capitalism's racism, is how it basically segregates the world into the global north, or the imperial core, and the peripheries, or the global south, where the body of people who occupy the global south are in fact racialized people. So for me, if we're going to talk about racism, and we can understand racism in the context of a sort of somatic racism we experience on the basis of our skin color, and racism we experience on the interpersonal level, but we don't understand the economics of racism that mean that the possibilities of transformation for the empire are necessarily predicated on the suffering of people in places we can't see who look like us, then we miss a huge part of the global scale of racism. And through this economic lens, we're able to better see the logics of racism beyond what it's presented to us, as we're sort of ideologically somewhat, confused and mystified and, intentionally obscured from our relationship with the realities of a racist system of capitalism, which is the system of capitalism. You can't disentangle these two things. Now, a secondary sort of point, or a third point to thinking about capitalism's racism, is something that is a little bit more contemporary. So when we think about the concept of the Commonwealth, when we think about post-World War II Britain and the advent of migration from the colonies to Britain. Now, we've had this history of a systematic exclusion of Black people from property ownership, the extraction of natural resources from their homes, their displacement through enslavement, their death through enslavement and through the profits of their death. And now we exist within a world system whereby to be a person of color, to be a member of the global south, of the peripheries, is to be at a systematic economic disadvantage on the most part than anyone who exists in the imperial core. And so in the advent of migration, you have people who are already economically deprived entering a space of wealth, a space where all of a sudden they get to see, the accumulation that is predicated on their death. But that did not necessarily mean an open welcoming into that system. As we know, if we look historically at the experiences of people who migrated to post-war Britain for the purposes of helping build the economy, because Britain was devastated substantially, and Britain asked for the Commonwealth to help in an extent, they were entering a system which also segregated them. A system that said that your labor, by virtue of your race and by virtue not being a sort of full citizenship or full citizen based on things like whiteness, mean that you will be substantially less paid for types of labor. And in fact, in that sort of advent, there was a sort of uproar from white British workers because they didn't want migrant workers, because migrant workers were going to be paid less and they thought they would be displaced. But instead, what happened was there was just a system of paying migrant workers less, and white workers were systematically benefiting from the sort of labor that was being extracted and hyper-exploited. It's also important to think about the way that resources are sort of accumulated, resources are distributed when we think about the racist logics of capitalism. So displaced populations of people already economically marginalized, migrants into the colonies who come here to help are also marginalized because their labor is devalued on the basis of race and citizenship. And they oftentimes also are excluded from particular types of communities. So they settle in similar areas. They create communities. They build a semblance of home, somewhere that they're excluded, somewhere they face racist attacks, somewhere where their labor is devalued. And those communities then become targeted for chronic underfunding and under-resourcing because the priorities are to the white British citizens. So we have this legacy of a long history of exclusion from Black people into the sort of economic system of capitalism. But now, in the contemporary moment, we're seeing that exclusion sort of disappear. We're seeing a pop-up of Black folk who are wealthy here and there. But does that substantially mean that the population of Black folk who are, or brown folk who have been historically displaced, historically exploited, are benefiting from said sort of economic transfer? Absolutely not. Because the class interests of the upper class mean that how they exchange wealth tends to be in a very sort of small community of other wealthy people. And so we're in this age where we are seeing what looks like capitalism is not as racist because Black people are able to get wealth, but the logics are inherently racist, because racism is not simply, as we discussed in the conversation about representation, about who looks like us, but it's also about the community of people who are exploited in order for wealth to accumulate. We have to stretch our understanding of racism beyond the interpersonal, beyond the representative, and think about the historical economic implications of racism that have been interwoven and that are part and parcel of capitalism's genealogy, capitalism's sustenance, and capitalism's rearticulation of itself in this current era. Now, why is this question of economics important? It's important because, as we all see, and when we look at reports, for example, by the Runnymede Trust, POC, Pakistani, Bengali, Black African, and Black Caribbean populations are still, when compared to white populations, so systematically economically deprived, so devoid of resources. When we look in the funding space and some of the work that you've done, Martha, we also know that funding that exists isn't going to these communities. And the fundamental question here for me is that we need to understand that wealth isn't just something that you have. Wealth is something that you gain, and you gain by taking away. You gain by exploitation, you gain by extraction, you gain by accumulation. So the question of capitalism's racism and the experiences of racially marginalized groups is not a question of necessarily aid, as it's primarily thought about within the third sector. It is necessarily a question about reparations. It's necessarily a question about restoration. It's necessarily a project about recognizing that wealth has been historically accumulated through violence, through death, through hyper-exploitation, through the exportation of things we do not want to see in our civilized country to places that we cannot see, that allow us to have the day-to-day lives that we have. And so the question about wealth, the question about capitalism, racism in the context of the third sector really needs to stretch beyond this sort of like false logic that we need to help these poor communities, when what we really need to do is recognize that we've extracted from these poor communities. We've created a system of false scarcity, which was actually a really important system the state used to disenfranchise and to break down grassroots organizing that happened in the 60s and 70s at a time where Black people were recognizing their disenfranchisement, where people of color were recognizing their disenfranchisement and recognizing the interconnectedness of that economic, cultural, systematic, and ideological oppression. And what was done now, and I think what the charity sector has inherited too, is this logic of scarcity, is this logic that we are beholden to funders because they give us the money and we have to be really specific about where we funnel it to. And, you know, there's so much bureaucracy and administration and questions and, you know, valuations that need to happen before we help these communities, when we need to fundamentally asking ourselves, how have we allowed the third sector to become part of the ideological machinery that obscures the relationship between racism and the economics? How have we done that? How are we complicit in that? How do we, through our lack of recognition of history, lack of recognition of the basics of economics and wealth accumulation, miss this whole project that we are now conscripted to being a part of? We are now the gatekeepers of redistribution without recognizing that these communities are inherently deserving of wealth, of resources, of material security, of things that allow themselves to not feel constantly and consistently precarious.